Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the Philippines, its history and its current political situation, in which the son of the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos Jr., is beginning his presidency, as is Vice President Sara Duterte, the daughter of the previous controversial president Rodrigo Duterte. Their election victory is seen by some as the Philippines embracing an illiberal form of government. We'll talk about all of this as well as the history of the Philippines, which includes the American occupation in the previous century. My guest for this is Luis H. Francia. Luis Francia teaches at New York University, is the author of a number of books of poetry, essays, and history, including A History of the Philippines, From Indios Bravos to Filipinos. He's also an online columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. Next week, he has a play that is going to debut in New York City called The Strange Case of Citizen de la Cruz. It is a satire on dictatorship and also on the Marcoses. It is being staged between August 10th and 13th. You can also watch it online. Just go to the website atlanticpacifictheater.org. We'll give details of that play throughout our conversation today. Luis Francia, a very good morning to you. Thank you for taking this time to join me today.
Thank you for having me.
What would you explain to somebody who's not following the Philippines closely, what's happening right now in the country?
It's, to put it in one word, insanity. No one would have thought in 1986, when the Marcoses had to flee the Philippines after the People Power Uprising, that we would see them A, return, and B, not only return physically, but return to the heights of power. So now we have the son, the namesake of Ferdinand Marcos, assuming the presidency. His mother is still with us, Imelda Marcos, who was part of the conjugal dictatorship. So they have returned, and some say that they never left because the structures, the allies that they had, remained in place even as they were in exile in Hawaii. So, given the fact that quite a bit of time has passed since 1986, the voting population in the Philippines is much, much younger. And a majority of them either were too young to remember martial law or were never born during the martial law years. So the Marcoses, with a treasure chest of billions of pesos, were able to use social media and an army of trolls to flood the electoral venues with misinformation. And so Marcos, he never participated in the presidential debates because he said, I'd rather appeal directly to the voters. So that was one tactic that his campaign used. And B, they did have a sophisticated use of social media on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, the whole gamut of the social media apparatus says, so that the overwhelming majority of the young voters bought into the notion that the era of Marcos's martial law was actually a golden age, which of course those of us who remember and experience martial law find laughable. But given the way that, for instance, in the United States, you have a huge block of Americans believing still that Donald Trump won the election, it's not surprising that you have a similar result in the Philippines and elsewhere. So social media has become the battleground, and in the case of the recently concluded elections in the Philippines, the Marcos campaign and the Duterte campaign were able to use social media triumphantly. Okay, so it's deja vu. And it really confirms the aphorism, those who are unaware or ignorant of history are condemned to repeat it. So we are seeing a repeat of history. So Bongbong, as he's popularly known, promises basically to follow in the footsteps of his father. Because the thinking is, if the Marcos era was a golden age, then it would be logical to try and revive that golden age. What does that mean in reality? It means basically not apologizing for the many, many flagrant human rights abuses that were perpetrated under the Marcos regime, the plunder and the cronyism that plagued the Philippines and that still continue to plague the Philippines, and the rise of export labor. It was under Ferdinand Marcos that the mechanisms for exporting human capital were instituted. So today, 10% basically of the Filipino population live and work abroad. And it's the remittances that basically sustain the Philippine economy. I believe last year they sent back $31 billion. So we see the legacy of the first Marcos regime still having a lasting impact on the current Philippine political situation. And Ferdinand Jr. is not going to do anything to disrupt those legacies.
You mentioned both the campaigns of Marcos, Bongbong Marcos, and Sara Duterte. How does the presidential political system in the Philippines work? Are these separate positions that each person runs for office? And how closely aligned then are Bongbong Marcos and the Marcoses with the Dutertes? Of course, Rodrigo Duterte was a very controversial president who just finished his presidential term. And now his daughter, Sara Duterte, is the vice president. Did they each have to run in their own campaign?
Yes, the system in the Philippines is quite unique. You can run for president, and the vice president will run separately. They don't have to be on the same campaign platform. In fact, the vice president of Rodrigo Duterte was Leni Robredo, who's from a different political party. And basically, when that happens, when you have the president and the vice president from different political parties, what the president will do, as Duterte did, was basically shun Leni Robredo, and basically she was not in any position to affect policies that were emanating from the administration. So it has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. With Marcos, Bongbong, and Sara Duterte, it was basically a marriage of convenience. Originally, Sara Duterte was eyeing a presidential run, but she decided to throw in her lot with Bongbong, and because her poll numbers were quite high, that boosted Bongbong Marcos's poll numbers as well. So they started out with a huge poll advantage, and it also made political sense because the Marcoses are from the north and the Dutertes are from the south. So they were able to unite two powerful political blocs. Now, Sara Duterte is also an experienced politician. She succeeded her father as mayor of Davao City, which is an important metropolitan area in Mindanao. And she's quite astute politician, and the feeling is that she's much more politically adept than Bongbong. So that Bongbong Marcos, on the one hand, will have his mother, Imelda. You can bet Imelda is cackling gleefully at the fact that her son is now president and it's kind of restoring the Marcos and burnishing the Marcos name. But she will certainly have a lot of input into the policies of her son. And Sara Duterte will also be able, kind of like Cheney was to George W. Bush in the first term. So the thinking is that Bongbong, smooth, likable, but a lightweight politically. You will have the two women, Imelda and Sara Duterte, who are both quite wily and very well versed in political infighting, who will set the tone and a lot of the policies that will be forthcoming from the Bongbong Marcos administration.
Are their politics aligned?
Basically, yeah. Sarah, for instance, very recently, Bongbong Marcos said that the Philippines would not be rejoining the International Criminal Court because the ICC is investigating Rodrigo Duterte's human rights record, particularly with regards to the drug war that was waged, horrifically under Duterte's watch. And so the Philippines withdrew, I think, maybe a year and a half ago. But the ICC has said that's fine because they're looking at the murders committed while the Philippines was still a member of the ICC. So the question was posed, I think, last week to the administration, will you be rejoining the ICC? And obviously and clearly the answer was no. And the reason given was that the justice machinery in the Philippines will be, and in fact is looking into the human rights charges leveled against the Duterte administration. So the thinking is that we don't need an international agency to determine the course of judicial action in the Philippines because we are doing it. But nobody believes for a moment that with Sara Duterte as vice president, that any serious investigation will be done by the government to look into the extrajudicial killings.
I mean, basically into her father, right?
Yeah, she's not going to go against her father, So it's going to be a whitewash, basically.
Tell me about these allegations of extrajudicial killings.
They were really a war against the poor. First of all, there really is no drug crisis in the Philippines. Technically, to have a drug problem in a country, you have to have at least 1% or a little more than 1% of the populace actively using drugs. And that's not true in the Philippines. Secondly, the people killed were mostly the poor, the people who lived on the margins. If the war on drugs was ever serious, it never targeted the drug kingpins. And there were quite a few well-known drug kingpins that were never touched. So the vast majority of those killed were slum dwellers who had no legal protection. And, it's like the favelas in Brazil. The cops come in, barge, take out whomever they deem a suspect, bring him out in some squalid corner, and shoot him and put a gun in his hand, and most of them have been male, and then say that the suspect fought back. Okay, and therefore we had no recourse but to shoot him. And there have been, I think the human rights organizations have documented about more than 30,000 of these extrajudicial killings. The official count under the Duterte administration has been about one-sixth of that, or 5,000 killings that they say are being investigated. But most of those investigations have gone nowhere, you know. So it's really a war on the poor. From if you look at the class of those who have been killed.
You mentioned earlier that Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and his supporters have called for a return to, I guess, the golden era of rule from his father, Ferdinand Marcos, which has, not just have you declared, but by fact, instituted a period of martial law. Talk to me about Ferdinand Marcos, the senior. He was elected as president in 1965. So he was democratically elected in 65. What happened afterwards? He would rule until 1987.
Yeah, well, under the Philippine Constitution, which is in some ways patterned, the Constitution then, patterned after the U.S. Constitution, the president is limited to two terms, two successive terms. And so Marcos was reelected to serve a second term, and he wanted to continue beyond the constitutional limit. And so in 1972, a year before his term was to expire, he declared a state of emergency, saying that there were, because of a number of bombings in the metropolitan area, most of which had no victims except for the first one, which was really targeted at the opposition. But then he said these bombings are being orchestrated by the communist underground. So he said, in order to preserve the unity and the integrity of the Philippine society, I need to declare martial law. And he declares martial law on September 22nd, but backdates it to September 21st because he believed that number 7 was his magical number, and 21 is divisible by 7. 22 isn't. So it declares martial law, saying the communist underground, the New People's Army, is a threat. We must meet it head on. And the only way right now is to institute martial law, giving him, of course, authoritarian power. The writ of habeas corpus is suspended under martial law. And so begun the rule of a dictator from 72 until he was ousted in February of 1986. In that period, ironically, the two insurgencies grew. Rather than quelling them, the communist left, the New People's Army and the Communist Party of the Philippines, the student activists, radical intellectuals, and worker activists went underground and bolstered the ranks of the Communist Party, and recruiting began for the armed wing, the New People's Army. At the same time, in Mindanao was formed the Moro National Liberation Front, because under martial law, Marcos authorized the army to confiscate the vast numbers of firearms that were obtainable in the Philippines, and the Muslims felt without their arms they would not be able to defend themselves against a mainly Catholic army, the Philippine army. So they basically formed the Moro National Liberation Front. I mean, it was there already, but the declaration of martial law added fuel to the fire in both cases. So martial law had the reverse effect. Rather than quelling these insurgencies in the bud, it inflamed them further. Secondly, it allowed his cronies to participate in basically a nationwide plunder. Okay, foreign debt under Marcos grew from 600 million when he took office in 65 to $26 billion by the time he left office. And a lot of that was due to projects that were never really meant to improve the country. And one example is the Bataan nuclear power plant. Okay, that cost 2 billion, but because the payment was it kind of like over on an installment basis, the actual cost was $22 billion, and a lot of that money was siphoned off to certain cronies of the Marcoses. And the power plant was never put in use because people protested and saying this is a danger. It was situated near a fault line and by the ocean. So imagine if you had a tsunami or an earthquake or both, it would have been a disaster. So under Marcos, the foreign debt increased, cronyism became institutionalized, key industries were given to favored friends of his, and the export of human capital was institutionalized as well. And we see that today when with 10% of the Filipino population basically having to work abroad to sustain their families because there's no work to be had in the Philippines. There has been no sustained effort at industrialization. So we see the legacies of martial law and the Marcos rule continuing to this day. And so when Marcos Jr. says this was a golden age, that means he's not going to change anything that will disrupt this fake narrative.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about the politics and the history of the Philippines. Our guest is Luis H. Francia. Luis Francia teaches at New York University, author of a number of books, including A History of the Philippines, From Indios Bravos to Filipinos. He's also an online columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. And next week, he is debuting, well, I don't know if debut is the correct term, but you are going to have one of your plays performed called The Strange Case of Citizen de la Cruz. It's going to be from August 10th to August 13th. It's going to be in New York City. However, you can see a stream of it online. Just go to the website atlanticpacifictheater.org, and we will link that site to our website at kpfa.org as well. I'll give those details before we wrap up at the end of our conversation again. Luis Francia, I want to follow up with questions about both the communist and Islamic insurgencies that you referenced earlier in the 1970s. To begin with the communist movement, is this a product or a part of the Cold War?
Absolutely. The communist movement in the Philippines goes back to right after World War II. You know, there was the agrarian revolt, the Communist Party, the old Communist Party. You have to differentiate between the new Communist Party, which is dominant now, and the old Soviet-leaning Communist Party of the Philippines. The later one basically reoriented itself towards Mao's China, you know, because the thinking was, we're in Asia. Why do we need to follow the Soviet model? Let's follow the Chinese model. But at any rate, communism as a political force has been part of the Philippines, particularly after World War II, when agrarian unrest was still very much a factor. And so you had these different groups that fought the Japanese peasants and small farmers, and they kept together and formed the hooks. You know, it's a stand in for, in English, the new army fighting the Japanese, which then becomes the Revolutionary Army of the Philippines after the Japanese were forced out of the Philippines. And in the late 60s, you had the new Communist Party under Chairman Jose Maria Sison, or Joma as is known, who's now in exile in The Hague, leaving the old Communist Party because he said, it's outmoded, we need to form a new party. So, because of martial law, he was able to use Marx's authoritarian impulses to generate and to increase the number of recruits both into the New People's Army and into the ranks of the Communist Party of the Philippines, the CPP. Okay, so they were very much a, shall we say, indicative of the Cold War politics. Because basically the Cold War simplistically divided the world into, the evil empire, quote unquote, the Soviet Union, and the freedom-loving forces, i.e. the United States and its Western allies, and other allies, including the Philippines. So the Philippines officially was very much on the side of the United States. But of course, there was the non-aligned movement that I think Indonesia was one of its leading lights under Sukarno. And so the Communist Party of the Philippines was definitely part and parcel of the Cold War struggles that played out. Okay, the U.S. had advisors for the Philippine Army fighting the communists in the Philippines, both the old and the new ones. And the Philippines, under Marcos, sent a non-combatant unit to Vietnam, which was going on at the same time. So absolutely, the internecine struggles in the Philippines were part of the Cold War struggle globally.
The United States backed the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos.
Yeah, because of the basis, first of all. At that time, the U.S., the two largest bases outside the U.S. mainland and outside Hawaii were in the Philippines. Subic Bay Naval Base and Clark Air Force Base. And these were used staging grounds for the Vietnam War and also for the war on Iraq and in the Middle East. And the bases were, the treaty was not, taken on and renewed in 1992 when the Philippine Congress, in a rare act of independent foreign policy thinking, refused to renew the treaty for the bases. Okay, but it doesn't mean there are no U.S. troops in the Philippines. Under Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, when 9/11 happened, Arroyo was one of the first, if not the first foreign leader to say we are with the United States. And basically, her administration and the U.S. had an agreement that allowed U.S. boots on the ground under a looser arrangement to be in the Philippines. And they're still there in certain parts of the Philippines.
I do also want to ask about the Muslim insurgency in the 1970s and I guess 1960s. And this is fascinating to me because the religious history of the Philippines is fascinating. We can go back more than 1,000 years, and I think we have we find Hinduism and Buddhism, and then in the 14th century, the Muslims arrive, the archipelago, and bring Islam. And this is a good 100+ years before Magellan would ever find the archipelago and before Spain would even bring Catholicism. So we do hear about frequently over the years Islamic separatist, I guess, in the Philippines. What I think most people don't realize is even though today the Philippines is predominantly a Catholic nation, that Islam is much older to the islands than Christianity or Catholicism.
Absolutely. Islam came through the southern island of Mindanao, because it's very close to Borneo, Indonesia, and the Middle East. The trade routes from the Middle East would have had to pass through the Straits of Malacca, which is in Malaysia, and then through Mindanao. So when you have Arab traders who are of the Islamic faith, and they bring not only their goods, but their faith. So the Islamic faith had, I think, 2 or 3 sultanates in Mindanao. Certainly Sulu and Holo, and I think Marawi. So Islam was starting to move northward. Manila was already a Muslim settlement when the Spanish came and colonized the Philippines. So what Spain did was to disrupt the spread of Islam throughout the rest of the Philippines. So Islam has been kept mainly the southern half of Mindanao. But there have been Hindu influences and Buddhist influences because there was no nation state before the Spanish colonized the Philippines in 1565. So, you had the different islands and you had the different Asian faiths that came.
They were their own. They were their own kingdoms, each island.
Yeah, basically they were separate. Maybe you would have an island that might have several city, or maybe not the term city, but different tribal groups that were in contact with each other, but had their own rules and structures, although they were quite similar. The Islamic sultanates were different because they were aware of the community of other Muslims in other parts of Asia as well as within the Philippines. So when the Spanish arrived, they were the ones who were able to offer organized resistance to the Spanish. So while they were not able to move beyond Mindanao, they were able to prevent the Spanish from taking over Islamic Mindanao. I believe until the late 19th century, when the Spanish fleet from Manila was able to dominate Sulu, but it just meant a military occupation that didn't last long because of the Spanish-American War and the Philippine American War. So the Visayas, which is the central part of the Philippines, from the name, we can infer that there was a Hindu influence in that area. It was part of the Sri Vijaya Empire. Okay, so the Philippines, while most people think of it as a basically Catholic/Christian country, does have a number of faiths that were there before the advent of Christianity. And of course, you have the indigenous folkways and folk religions that still are there and still survive.
Fidel Ramos died this past weekend. He was president of the Philippines from 1992 to 1998. He was a military leader. In the papers that I read about his death, he was described as somebody who was pro-democracy and somebody who also was able to reconcile with both communist and Muslims. Is this how you would identify him? Can you tell me your thoughts about Fidel Ramos?
Yeah, Ramos was he was able to overcome his standing as a Marcos man because they were cousins. But of course, because of the February 1986 People Power uprising, he chose to side with the uprising against Marcos. Whether or not he did that out of principle or because he saw that the boat was sinking, I'm not sure. But the thing is, he sided with the pro-Aquino, pro-democracy forces. And as we know, it succeeded, the uprising, and it drove the Marxists out. And he was a pragmatist. You know, he wanted to make sure that the Philippine society, would return to some stability. Because during the last maybe 5, 6 years of the Marcos era, it was crazy. You know, the economy was not doing very well. You had the insurgencies. Activism was very much, in flower. And the foreign debt was increasing. So Marcos was also sick. He was aging and not in very good physical health. So clearly the handwriting was on the wall. And I think Ramos, part of his calculation was, it's time to move on. And of course, people remind others that he was the head of the Philippine Constabulary under Marcos, and the PC was responsible for quite a number of human rights abuses. Okay, but given the nature of Philippine society, which tends, in my view, to forgive too easily, he was able to parlay his role in the People Power Uprising to a position as Chief of Staff and Defense Secretary under Cory Aquino. And to his credit, he defended there against 7 coup attempts. Okay, he was able to neutralize these coup attempts.
Who did the coup attempts come from?
The military. There was a group called the Reform the Armed Forces Movement, which instigated the coup attempt that began the People Power Uprising. They basically didn't want Cory as president, and you can see the hand also of Juan Ponce Enrile, who also turned against Marcos. But Enrile is a much more cunning figure, and there is credible evidence to show that he may not have opposed the coup attempts. He may have stayed silent, but he shouldn't have stayed silent. So Ramos, on the other hand, was much more active in putting them down. So Cory anointed him as her successor, and he won in the succeeding election. And he was able to grow the economy, of course, in a neoliberal way, which has many flaws, but he was able to bring a measure of stability and also broker peace treaties with the communist armed wing and the Muslims. And so we see that today they're not such a threat, if to use for lack of a better term, in Philippine society. So he did a credible job as president of the Philippines, and the transfer of power was peaceful to Joseph Erap Estrada, who unfortunately was a disaster. Okay.
Is that where we start to see, do you think, sort of the pro-democracy movements fall apart? How do we go from this period of the 90s into a period in which we now have the election of Bongbong Marcos, the son of Ferdinand Marcos, and now Sara Duterte? Oftentimes their election, again, has been characterized as a support of illiberal politics. How do we go from where we were in the 90s to where we are today?
Very good question. And partly when Ramos was succeeded by Estrada was a pro-Marcos president. Okay. and he made no bones about it, but he was elected democratically, so he ruled. But he was incompetent, he was often drunk, and so we had a rehash of the People Power Uprising of 1986, I believe in 2001 or 2000, when people again took to the streets to demand that he resign because there was hard evidence that he had been accepting. He had set up bank accounts under a fake name, and by then his popularity had waned dramatically. So the military then withdrew its support, and he was forced to resign, and his vice president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, took over. And initially, Arroyo said, "I'm only going to serve out the term of Ramos, of Estrada, rather." And but then, halfway through the remaining years, I think there were maybe 3 more years, he said, "I've changed my mind. I'm going to run for the president the next election because, after all, I was never elected president. So technically, I can run." And people were disappointed, and many of her cabinet members resigned because they felt she was a fresh wind. She's well educated, an economist, a technocrat, so very different from Estrada. And she took the business of being president seriously. However, in the elections that followed, there was credible evidence that there was cheating on the part of her party in certain areas of Mindanao that gave her the edge. So Cory Aquino and Ramos seemed to be a reprieve, but brief reprieve, from the traditional feudal politics that have governed the Philippines since the colonial times. And so with Estrada, Arroyo, and then from onwards, except again for Noynoy Aquino, the son of Cory, he was competent and no corruption issues against him. But then he was succeeded by Duterte. Okay, so the presidents that succeeded Ramos, only one, Noynoy Aquino, was a decent presidency, not great, but decent. But you had Arroyo and Duterte and Estrada, of course, and now we wind up with the Marcoses. So basically, dynastic political power is back in the Philippines. And that means that access to political power is very limited for those of the populace that are not related or in the dynastic circles. And I think there are maybe a bit over 200 political dynasties in the Philippines, according to a political science study. Yeah, so, it's a sad state of affairs.
The Spanish started their colonization of the Philippines in the 16th century and then would control the Philippines for hundreds of years, only to be replaced by the United States in 1898. And after the Spanish American War, the United States would then continue that colonization for several decades. I think it gets a little complicated. Eventually we have the Japanese that step in.
Well, also, let's not forget the Philippine American War of 1899. The Spanish were defeated by the United States, but the United States entered that war promising to help liberate the Philippines from colonial rule, but then backtracks and says, "Hey, wait a minute, we defeated the Spanish surrendered to us. Technically, we can take over the Philippines as a colony." And the Filipinos said, "Hey, wait a minute, you're supposed to be on our side. Isn't it time you went home?" And thus begins the 1899 Philippine American War, which was the precursor to the Vietnam War, because it's the first guerrilla war in Asia that the United States had to deal with, and it was more brutal and lasted longer than the Spanish American War. Okay, so the US takes over the Philippines, but what's often neglected is it seems to have taken over peacefully after the Spanish American War. Not at all. It took maybe from 1899 to 1913 before the archipelago was finally pacified and brought under U.S. colonial rule. I just wanted to make that clear.
I'm glad you did, because neglected indeed it is. It's a war that's not really taught or talked about a lot here in American history.
Absolutely. So many references still today. They get to the Spanish American War and then leap immediately to the U.S. rule. So the war against the Philippines on the part of the United States is elided. And, there's a whole history there. Mark Twain was very much against the war of the United States against the Philippines. The anti-war movement actually begins with protests and opposition to the war against the Philippines. The Anti-Imperialist League began, I believe, in Boston. It had 1 million members. Twain was its most famous proponent. So there's a whole history there that people need to be aware of. When I teach, I always ask my students, how many have heard of the Spanish-American War? Everyone will raise their hands. And then I follow that up with, how many have heard of the Philippine American War? Maybe 2 or 3 hands will be raised. And then I say, well, you have to relook at that history. And then I talk about the Philippine American War, which is to this day just a footnote, when in fact there should be a major chapter on it.
Is it a war that's remembered in the Philippines?
Oh, yes. When I was going to school, it wasn't, because it was a very colonial, Western-centric education. But with martial law, there was this resurgence of nationalism, and the Philippine American War becomes part of the educational curriculum. So people now, since the 70s, are much more aware. I only became aware of the Philippine American War when I moved to New York, and I found myself intrigued by the war, the opposition to the war in Vietnam. And once I did research, I found out that the Philippine American War predates the Vietnam War, because it's the same rhetoric. We will improve your lives, we're bringing you democracy, blah, blah, blah. And so if you look at those 2 wars, in terms of rhetoric, nothing much has changed. In fact, in terms of warfare tactics, some similar tactics were used. Hamleting, and the water torture, very similar in both wars.
Do you see the politics today in the Philippines as being connected to a colonial past?
Yes and no. Not as much as in maybe during the Cold War era. But you still have, in terms of pop culture, definitely. Secondly, you still have the military aid being given to the Philippines, and the Philippines is seen as an ally of the United States, particularly now that China is rising as a world power. So it may not be as dominant, but the legacy of U.S. colonialism is still there, culturally, and to me, that's the more lasting legacy, through culture. It's still Hollywood, the cinema of Hollywood. Of course, that's true for a lot of the globe, but the Philippines was basically considered the bastion of US-style democracy in Asia. And while that may not be touted as much today, it's still seen as a vital ally of the US. Yeah, so you can still see the lingering effects of US imperial rule.
Luis Francia has been our guest. Again, he teaches at New York University. He's author of a number of books, including A History of the Philippines, From Indios Bravos to Filipinos. He's also an online columnist with the Philippine Daily Inquirer. And next week, he is having one of his plays performed in New York City that you can also catch online. The play is called The Strange Case of Citizen de la Cruz. It is a satire on dictatorship and really on the Marcoses. It's being staged next week between August 10th and August 13th. You can find out more about this, including how to stream it, at AtlanticPacificTheater.org. Again, that's AtlanticPacificTheater.org. We will also link it to our website at kpfa.org. Professor Francia, that was fascinating, and I thank you dearly for taking this time to join me today.